Welcome, I'm Mary Pohl, your host for the Sales Mastery Summit. What if you could accurately predict the sales from your sales pipeline? Today's expert is known around the world for helping sales teams get the lumps of coal out of their own sales pipelines. With me today is Dave Kurlan, author of Baseline Selling. Welcome, Dave.
Thank you, Mary. It's nice to be here.
Well, pleasure to have you. This week, we are actually focused on how to help our viewers drive greater personal productivity. And of course, focusing on the sales pipeline is extremely important in this case. If you want to get greater return for less effort, then of course, having the right opportunities in the pipeline and progressing them through the buying cycle is the way to go. But this is easier said than done. So today I'm counting on you, Dave, to help our viewers with tips on how to make this an actual reality instead of academic thinking. So I hope you're up for the challenge.
We can try.
Okay, fabulous. Now I know that the topic of helping people create effective sales pipelines is something that you're very passionate about. Can you share with us why is this such a hot topic for you?
Well, I work with a lot of companies, and I've been doing this for about 27 years. And it doesn't seem to matter what industry they're in, how big they are, how many salespeople they have, who they call on, who's managing them. One constant thread of, I know what it's going to look like before I even see it, is the pipeline. And it never seems to be anything more than, well, here's our pipeline. And they give me a report, and it's got a list of all the opportunities, and it's not backed up by much information. It's not staged. If it is staged, it isn't in a stage based on any kind of criteria. It's just whatever stage the salesperson put it in. And it isn't in a form where you can take a quick look at it and you know exactly what kind of shape your business is in. And one of the problems with that is that if you're getting a report out of a CRM system and it just lists all these opportunities, then from one week to the next, you're pretty much, as a sales manager anyhow, looking at the exact same report you looked at last week. And you can't really tell what's moving, how much it's moved, where it moved from, where it moved to, and whether the probability of it closing has gotten any greater than it was last week. So you end up ignoring these reports because I've seen this before. There's nothing here that's useful to me. And when you start ignoring the reports in the pipeline, and you stop having discussions about what was in that report with your salespeople, you can't coach them on moving the opportunities forward based on having a common, accurate starting point. And in the end, forecasts are totally inaccurate. And they're generally inaccurate for three reasons. We have three variables that salespeople tend to get wrong. And those three variables are the amount that this opportunity might be worth, the value of it, how much that account might spend. And the salespeople always overestimate what that might be. And then there's the projected close date. And the projected close date is usually earlier than what it will actually be. And then finally, there's the likelihood of closing. And the salespeople are overly optimistic about their chances of closing a business because if somebody liked them, they think they're going to buy from them. So with those three variables always being wrong, the forecast will always be wrong. And whether I'm a salesperson looking at the output from what I've put in, or I'm the sales manager looking at what my salespeople have put in, if I don't have an accurate forecast, I can't drive revenue. And this is all about driving revenue and doing it more effectively.
That makes total sense.
So, and I apologize for having such a long opening remark.
No, actually, you gave me a great framework for many other questions to ask you, so I appreciate that.
I'm all about framework.
Okay. Well, I hope then that you have a good framework for how to get the gold bullion into your pipeline and keep the nasty coal out.
Well, the nasty coal comes from a disease called happy years, where salespeople hear what they want to hear, hope what they want to hope, and do what they want to do without it being based on reality. So a strong set of criteria for each stage of the pipeline helps to eliminate happy years, but doesn't do the entire trick. If I'm a salesperson and I ask a prospect, well, so how does this sound to you? and the prospect says, well, it sounds pretty good. The salesperson with happy ears goes, they're going to buy from me. And they go ahead and check off all the criteria and say, yep, 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 yep. And it doesn't really matter what the criteria is, they're going to check it off. So in addition to having criteria, salespeople must approach all their opportunities with not only optimism about the outcome, but skepticism about everything they're hearing.
Okay.
So if I'm a salesperson and I ask that same question, and I would never ask this question, but salespeople ask this question, how does this all sound to you? And the prospect says, well, that sounds pretty good. As a salesperson, you have to follow that up with, tell me why. What exactly sounds good? Why does it sound good? How does that compare with other stuff you've heard? How does that compare with other offerings, other companies, other salespeople? I mean, we've got to put it in context. Sounds good. Sounds good because that might mean you're about to be finished and you leave and I get the rest of my day back. Maybe that's why it sounds good to me. Sounds
Yeah, it's
good
kind of like
because
asking, how would you like to solve your problem? And then accepting their answer is, all right, we have an order.
Right. Sounds good because I heard enough to disqualify you. I don't have to worry about you being an option anymore. Sounds good because I know I don't want to do any business with you and I don't have to talk to you again. So without knowing what it means when a prospect says something, that's happy ears. So it requires a little bit of skepticism. It requires that salespeople not be so trusting. One of my companies is a Salesforce evaluation company. We evaluate sales organizations. We assess sales candidates. That's Objective Management Group. And one of the findings is whether or not salespeople are too trusting. And this is a staggering number. 93% of the 650,000 salespeople we've assessed are too trusting. And that's the formula for happy ears. There's another piece to that. Need for approval. How much a salesperson needs to be liked, or in extreme cases, loved. And when they need to be liked or loved, their primary goal is to make friends. Their primary outcome is that the prospect like them a lot. Now, if they happen to get business from them, that's bonus. So the symptoms of need for approval are not only that they have this need to be liked, but they have difficulty asking a lot of questions. They have more difficulty asking tough questions, and they have even greater difficulty asking the real challenging question, the pushback that nobody else has dared to do. Being able to say to you, you told me that price was important, but can I push back on that? I saw a Mercedes belonging to you in the parking lot. You've got beautiful Italian furniture in here. You don't seem like you've made decisions based on price. You look like you've gone for quality. Why are you telling me that price is important? And it doesn't matter what the pushback is. It could be pushback like that, or you said that one of the things that's important to you is that you do this quickly. Yet, you know as well as I do that in order to do this right, you can't rush it. So why did you say that? So pushback helps to differentiate a salesperson. Pushback helps to get a key decision maker's ear. Pushback builds credibility. Pushback speeds up the sales process because suddenly you're the only one having a particular conversation with a particular prospect. Yet folks with need for approval cannot, under any circumstances, ask a question if they fear that they might upset the apple cart, get somebody upset, and then they won't like them anymore.
Okay.
So even if they weren't too trusting, the question they would ask instead, sounds good, give me a call on Tuesday. Okay, they're going to buy from me on Tuesday, and they put it in their CRM system as a Tuesday close, and they tell their manager, we're going to close this on Tuesday. If they weren't too trusting and they were skeptical about call me Tuesday, the questions they'd have to ask. Well, Tuesday sounds good. Tell me, if you can, what do you expect to happen when we talk on Tuesday? Or how is Tuesday different than right now? What's going to happen between now and Tuesday that'll necessitate a Tuesday phone call? They can't ask those questions. So these two weaknesses, which are kind of hidden, nobody really knows they're there. Not even the salespeople are aware that those two weaknesses are in place. That kind of dictates which skills and tactics and best practices they'll actually use on the phone and out in the field. So even though they might have heard all the best practices, even though they might have been taught and coached what they ought to do in this situation, it's just stuff that they've learned. It's not something they're comfortable actually doing. And that's a huge part of why the pipelines are wrong and why the sales cycles are too long, because all this time is wasted while they're afraid to ask the next logical, the next necessary, the next crucial question.
Okay. Well, I can see why 93% of your survey participants are not pushback type people, because optimism kind of goes with the territory for a sales rep. So, being a skeptical sales rep is probably an anomaly.
Yeah, and the need to be liked, that's what causes people to say, hey, you ought to be in sales. Right? All the extroverts that are great at having conversations, you should be in sales.
Yeah.
Those are actually the worst people to be in sales. It takes introverts like me who are good at listening and asking questions and who don't care whether somebody likes them or not. The introverts make the better salespeople.
So I like the setup that you had earlier, that one way to coach an internal optimist who doesn't have natural pushback skills into asking these appropriate questions is having your criteria for each stage of the pipeline. Can you share some examples of what those criteria might be?
Sure. If we dig into the sales process in baseline selling, that's pretty simple. It's something everybody can relate to. It's first base, second base, third base, and home. Okay, so first base, that's a suspect, and in this process, that relates to a first scheduled meeting. It can be over the phone, it can be face-to-face. Second base is where the opportunity becomes an actual prospect. And to get to second base, here we get the criteria. The prospect must need what we have. There must be compelling reasons for them to spend money to buy what we're selling. And additionally, some compelling reasons to buy it from us instead of from somebody else. We need to develop what I call SOB quality. That doesn't stand for what you're thinking. It's not son of the boss. It's actually a baseball term, speed on the bases. Now, I'll do the quick baseball analogy. In baseball, the greatest base stealers, when you come right down to it, what they do so well, it's not steal a base. It's they get the pitcher to pay more attention to them than to the hitter. And if we translate that to selling, we've developed SOB quality when we can get our prospect to pay more attention to us than the competitors. And we develop SOB quality by building a stronger relationship, by listening, showing that we care, by developing credibility, trust, and we do all of that by simply asking questions. More questions than anybody else, better questions than anybody else, tougher questions than anybody else. And then the last criteria to getting to second base is what I call the rule of ratios. And the rule of ratios basically says that the cost of their problem or the value of their opportunity has to be at least double the price to do business with us. So if they're talking about some problem and this problem is costing them $50,000 a year and we're going to charge $250,000 to fix it, not much value there. But if the problem is costing them $1 million a year and we're going to charge $150,000 to fix it, and that fixes it forever, that's a tremendous value. So that's the criteria to get from first to second base. And if you want, I'll share the criteria to go from second and third, but you asked for an example.
Yeah, no, I would love for you to continue, because what's dawned on me is it's really turning a sales rep into a scientist. And rather than proving a hypothesis, like most people think, scientists are trying to disprove their hypothesis so they know it's ironclad. So essentially, you're trying to disqualify your prospect.
Exactly.
And as long as they pass your gates, they get to keep going.
Exactly. Yeah, and that helps to prevent the happy years because it makes it objective rather than subjective. If it's built into a CRM system, these are things that need to be checked off or entered in or agreed to. And if it's integrated, then the pipeline and the sales process hook up together. And as you follow the sales process and you check off the criteria, then the pipeline is being updated automatically. So it's all connected.
So if you would share the criteria to go from second base to third base.
I would. So third base is a qualified opportunity. So to become a qualified opportunity, the prospect needs to be committed to solving their problem or committed to pursuing the opportunity. They need in a commodity situation, in a price sensitive situation, one of the qualifying criteria to get to third would be that they're willing to spend more money with us to get it done the right way the first time, right now. In lieu of it being a commodity situation, a complex sale, that still might be an appropriate criteria, that they'll spend more to do business with us. But we want to establish that early enough in the process so that it's not a price war. We want to make sure they have the money. So those would be the two financial pieces, along with that we have acceptable terms and that they can pay and that they're credit worthy. So anything financial would get done at that point. And then around decision making, there are several pieces. One would be the timeline for the decision. That timeline has to make sense on both sides. We need to know and have met decision makers and make sure we have their agenda and their compelling reasons. We need to know the process for making that decision, and we need to know the criteria for making the decision. A lot of salespeople aren't real sure or clear on the difference between decision-making criteria and decision-making process. So the process would be, first we're going to do this, and then we're going to do this, and then we're going to talk to these people, and then we're going to review those things, and then we're going to meet, and then we're going to decide. And the criteria would be what happens when they decide. What are they going to base that decision on? And then there may be some company-specific qualifiers, whether it could be anything. Our location is okay, whether our time frames are okay, whether our specs are okay, whether we're an approved vendor, whether we're a minority-owned business. Whatever is specific to that vertical or their industry would also go into that second base to third base checklist.
Okay.
And then that gets us to third base. And then at third base with a qualified opportunity, now we start the run home. And that's where, originally we were going to talk about shortening a sales cycle. This is one of the areas where we shorten the sales cycle and firm up the pipeline and the forecast. The first step between third and home would be to talk about what we do, talk about our capabilities, tell our story, talk about our value proposition, and make a needs and cost appropriate presentation of how we're going to solve their problem or help them leverage the opportunity that's in front of them. Unfortunately, that's where most salespeople start the sales process.
Yeah, I was thinking that.
Okay, so for us, we've got that at the end of the sales process at third base.
Okay.
So the challenge is buying has changed. The rules of selling has changed. Everything has changed since around 2007. So salespeople are having a harder time getting invited in now, having a harder time scheduling meetings, finding it more difficult to get anybody to even take their calls. And then all of a sudden, they get a call from the prospect they've been trying to reach for 6 months and like, can you come in? And they're like, yes. So they get in, and as soon as they get there, the prospect says, so we've decided that we might be in the market to buy such and such. And we called you in based on your reputation. Would you be nice enough to talk about your capabilities and what you can do for us? And that's the best part of the sales process for most salespeople. That's what they're most comfortable with. It's what they're most prepared for. It's what's least threatening to them. So the big, what is stake in the ground, the line in the sand happens right there. Do they grab that bait and make their presentation and then do a proposal and then chase this business forever? Or do they put their hands up and say, hang on, I'd be happy to, but first, I don't know anything about why you need this or what brought this on. Is it okay if I ask a couple of questions first? And they drive the process back to first base. And they collect all the criteria between first and second, and they qualify the opportunity between second and third, because all the selling happens between first and second, and selling in second and third. Between third and home, anybody can do a presentation and a proposal. Mm-hmm. So by just presenting and proposing, and especially in technology companies, that they live to do demos. It's just demo, propose, close, chase. If they would just take a step back and see how awful their closing percentage is, see how pitiful their conversion ratios are, they'd see that they need to go backwards instead of forwards. And that would shorten the sales cycle. That would strengthen the pipeline. The reason the pipelines are so horrible, in addition to what I've already said, is nobody's doing any qualifying. Mm-hmm. Nobody's asking any questions. It's just presenting, proposing, and closing.
So you speed a lot of people up to third base that don't belong there, and then
right.
invest a lot of time and effort into a presentation when it might not be to anyone that matters.
Exactly. So if the first thing we say to a company once we're working with them is, so let's start by restaging all the opportunities in the pipeline. Okay. And whether we do it on paper, whether we do it in a group, whether we do it orally, whether we do it by email, in the end, most of the opportunities, whether they were at suspect, prospect, qualified, or closable, most of them need to go back to the suspect stage, because the salespeople haven't really learned anything about whether they need it, the compelling reasons to buy it. They haven't differentiated themselves. They've just come in and presented like everybody else. There isn't any qualification info, and it's going to end up being about price because they weren't able to differentiate. So they've commoditized themselves. Mm-hmm. It wasn't the prospect that did it. They self-inflicted commoditization.
Dave, have you seen any studies for the time investment for a sales rep at those different stages or different bases? And having skipped the first three, how much, or the first two, how much, how inefficient they are just jumping in at base three?
Yeah, it's very inefficient. I just started working with a company this month, and their problem is the sales cycle is too long, and they aren't getting any new business. So their existing business is good. There's plenty of renewal business. There's plenty of residual business, but they're flat because the salespeople are failing miserably at closing new business. So when we looked at what they were doing, we looked at their sales process. It's exact replica of what we just spent the last 20 minutes talking about. So what happens is when we just make them aware of what they're skipping, and when we can get them to do what's counterintuitive, which would be to slow down the whole sales process. Right now they're rushing through. They're just making that sprint from third to home. So it seems like a short sales process, but the sales process is really measured from when you first identify an opportunity to when you invoice or ship or collect the money. So based on that, the sales process is long, even though they only spent a relatively short amount of time doing anything. The rest of it was waiting. So when we can get them to actually execute the steps between first and second, and between second and third, which slows down their sales process, the sales process gets cut in half. Now, if we can get them to take an excruciating long time between first and second, that's the first meeting, that's the first discussion. That's where they need to ask all those questions and push back and challenge and learn about compelling reasons and differentiate themselves through their questions. If we can get them to take 30 to 45 minutes or even an hour in that one discussion that takes place between first and second base, which is probably 55 minutes longer than they've ever spent in that step of the sales process, then they can cut the sales process again by half. So if a sales process was 4 months, by adding second base and third base in, they can cut it down to 2 months. And if they can take this nice long time between first and second and spend an hour there, you can cut that sales process down in half again. Now, some of that's dependent on whether we have to build or engineer something. So some sales processes just can't go that fast because of, what we'd have to do on our end in order to be ready to sell somebody something. But if it isn't design build, if it isn't custom engineer, if it isn't the government, if it isn't OEM manufactured items, in most sales processes, we can literally chop it by 75% just by getting the salespeople to follow that process and teaching them how to sell consultatively between first and second base so that all the questions get asked and get answered.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you remind me that when people say sales is a numbers game, it's not about the numbers through your pipeline, it's about the win rate on the other end.
Right. And it hasn't been a numbers game for a long time. It's a smart game now. It's a professional game now. There was a time when it was a numbers game, just show up, get in front of enough people, and the numbers will be there. But there are a lot of companies where the salespeople are showing up and they're getting in front of enough people, and the results aren't there because they're still selling very transactionally. They're still relying on a presentation or a demo, and they're not adding any value. Today, with all the information that's on the internet, with everything they can learn on their own, if a salesperson doesn't show up and ask the right questions and show that they themselves are providing value to the process, then the product is a commodity and it comes down to price, and they'll buy from who they want to buy from when they want to buy, and the salesperson loses out.
I think you just clarified for us the difference between being busy and being productive.
Exactly. Good job.
Excellent. So you've already given us some great tips on shortening that sales cycle. Is there anything that you want to add to that before we talk about just overall pipeline management?
I think I've given away enough in the tip department. Let's go to pipeline management.
Okay, fabulous. What are your suggestions there?
Okay, for managing the pipeline, I think the key comes from the sales management side. I mean, we can talk about how a salesperson needs to self-manage the pipeline, but if I share the right instructions with you on what a sales manager should be able to do, any salespeople that are listening should be able to make the translation and do it to themselves.
Okay.
So the problem happens when we start a day, or we start a week, or we start a month, or we start a quarter, or we start a year, and the tendency is to look at the calendar and say, what do I have to do today? Who do I have to talk to? And the calendar pretty much dictates what we're going to do. But that calendar is in a vacuum. That calendar is just looking at today. The calendar isn't reflective of the business. It's not reflective of the goals. It's not reflective of what's going on. And the mistake salespeople make is by starting with the calendar. And while you have to look and see what you've got going on today or this week so you can prepare for it, the more important place to start is inside the pipeline. And that is, okay, which opportunities need to be moved? And do I have enough opportunities in the pipeline? How many new opportunities do I need to add? And which opportunities are ready for me to close? And if I start with those three questions, and then I go to the calendar, I can make room in my calendar to add the opportunities that need to be added, make follow-ups to the opportunities that need to be moved, and make calls to the opportunities that need to be closed. But if I stick to that calendar and that to-do list, which is what most people work with, then I'm not in sync with my business, with the other things that need to be going on that ensure that next week will be productive, and next month will be productive, and next quarter will be productive. Because that never stops. And a lot of salespeople tend to be event-driven. They can work on this until this is done, and then they're starting from scratch again. So there needs to be enough of a task-oriented approach to selling so that they can not only finish what they're working on, but also be working on the future business as well. A lot of salespeople don't handle that combination well.
It strikes me that approaching your planning the way you suggest will give you a great feeling of achievement at the end of the day rather than that you checked off a list.
Exactly. Exactly. And it's nice to check off a list, but checking off a list has never made me any money.
Exactly. So I think you've alluded to it, but this could be a nice way to tie everything together. Getting a more accurate sales prediction through your pipeline. What are your recommendations there?
Okay, so the forecast is only as accurate as the data, and the data is only as accurate as the inspection. And the inspection is only as accurate as the information in. So there must be 4 stages: suspect, prospect, qualified, closable. There must be criteria for each stage. Salespeople must be honest and realistic with themselves about where the opportunity is currently staged. And if it appears that they've missed a bunch of stuff, they've got to stage it earlier in the process where it belongs and backfill. And that's the big challenge. I thought this was closable, but based on the criteria, I guess it's still a suspect. I need to go back and ask questions. Oh, but I'm sure it's going to close. Sales manager's got to be there saying, I'm sorry, we're not doing this based on hope. We're not doing this based on what you think is going to happen. We're not doing this based on gut feel. Out of the 20 criteria that need to be met, we've only met 18. I'm sorry, we haven't met 18. So we need to go back and make sure that these are what you think they are. And we need to get the information that we don't know about, because it's possible that you're proposing the totally wrong solution at the entirely wrong price based on what they really need, because you don't know what they really need. So in the beginning, it's a lot of changing and moving and tweaking and restaging. And then when you get the hang of it, that's when it gets really simple and it gets really obvious and it starts to work kind of automatically. You know, once you own what has to happen in the sales process, once you own the process itself, once you're intuitively following the flow and collecting information, the pipeline takes care of itself.
Now, I can see how getting much more accurate about what stages we're in will help us better forecast the likelihood of close. You also mentioned that one of the big mistakes that we make is overestimating the value of a deal. So how can we circumvent that?
We might not be able to.
Okay.
Part of it is what a lot of sales training companies and a lot of companies teach their salespeople to ask. A lot of salespeople are being taught to ask, do you have a budget for this? And the prospect says, yes, we do. And then some people will say, would you mind sharing what that is? And some prospects will say, no, we won't. So that's where the overestimate comes in. Or the prospect says, no, we don't have a budget for this. I don't like either of those questions because most salespeople either end up getting the wrong answer or getting the wrong number. I think it's more important to have at the point in the process where they need to talk about money, which in my process is after second base. In that point in the process, the generic question would be, so are you willing to invest a little bit more money with us to get this done the right way, the first time, right now? Prospect says yes. Okay.
Nice way to handle it.
I don't know exactly what this is going to be yet. I still need to ask some more questions and go back and figure it out. But ballpark, are you willing to invest around? And they've got to throw a number out so that, prospect isn't saying we have a $20,000 budget, so it's got to be under that. If it's going to take $35,000 to do it the right way and get the problem solved or allow them to leverage an opportunity, then we shouldn't be talking about 20 or 25 or 27 or 34. We should be talking about 35. And we've got to find out, will they spend $35,000? And if they will, do they have it? Or do they have to go find it somewhere? They have to borrow from Peter to pay Paul. They have to put something off. Do they have to go against next year's budget? Well, but can they come up with that money and will they spend it? So If we know that they can get it and they'll spend it and they'll spend more with us, then we can be pretty accurate about what this deal will be worth. But
Okay.
most salespeople aren't having that kind of conversation. They're just doing that. Do you have a budget?
Yeah,
Good.
you set it up in a really nice way. Another expert told me, and I'll get the number wrong, but I think over 65% of closed sales opportunities didn't have a budget to start with. So it isn't a requirement, but they do have to have the ability to pay you.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I've got the right statistic on this one from my own statistics, but I think 53% of salespeople aren't able to uncover the actual number.
Okay.
It's
Just not
something
asking the right questions?
from not asking the right questions, from not caring, from skipping over it, from happy years, for whatever, from not being with the right person who would have the right answer. For any number of reasons, they don't have the right number going in.
Okay, interesting.
Now, there's a very simple way of controlling the forecast and the pipeline, and that's this. If you have a 6-month sales cycle and you have a 25% closing ratio and you have a $100,000 monthly goal, then it's really easy to figure out what has to happen. So 6 months, if let's see, this is going to be in an archive. So let's say that today is January 1st. We can't do anything about a January 1st opportunity in December. What we would have to do is impact that January 1st opportunity with a 6-month sales cycle in June. That's the time. So in June, if we need to make sure that we're going to close $100,000 in January, and our average sale is $25,000 and we close 25%, we just do the math. We're going to need $400,000 worth of opportunities entering the pipeline in June. And we're going to need 4 times 4, 16 of them. So 16 new opportunities worth a total of $400,000 enters the pipeline in June. That guarantees, based on our empirical data, $100,000 goal, 6-month sales cycle, $25,000 average sale, 25% closing ratio. That guarantees come January, $100,000 comes out the other end. So in part, there is a numbers to it, but it's not the numbers game we've usually played. It's a different numbers game. This is more based on science than just showing up.
Right.
So the management challenge is to make sure that the number of months ahead of the month, the number of months in the sales cycle ahead of the month we're trying to make sure we hit, that we make sure that what needs to enter the suspect stage of the pipeline gets entered. So whether that's self-accountability or management accountability, that's what we have to be held accountable to. Key performance metrics that guarantees when that month comes, we're golden.
That makes perfect sense. Yeah, and that's a smart way to play the numbers game.
How rare of me to make perfect sense.
Well, in case our viewers feel like you do make perfect sense in their lives too,
Once in a while.
Is there some place they can go to get more information on baseline selling?
Sure. There's a bunch of websites. They can go to baselineselling.com.
Okay.
And that has information on the book. They can go to my blog, Understanding the Salesforce, and that's omghub.com. OMG like oh my god, hub.com, except it stands for Objective Management Group. They can go to objectivemanagement.com, or they can go to kurlanassociates.com.
Okay.
Or if that's too confusing, davekurlan.com has links to all of those places.
Okay, perfect. Let me just jot that down. So, Dave, is there a favorite example that you have of a client that you worked with to really help them establish a smart sales pipeline and get this accuracy happening in their own business?
Yeah. I think every client kind of goes through the same turnaround and the same epiphanies and the same change. But there's one that I'm thinking of that was textbook. And all the things that we talked about today. So the very first thing we did after we evaluated their sales force and figured out why only 7 out of 60 salespeople were hitting their numbers, figuring out why they had 100% turnover. Once we had the answers to that, We were able to help them recruit the right salespeople. But the first thing we did with them was we customized a new sales process for them. So that's an incorporation of the baseline selling sales process plus their best practices. So we take the goals and the milestones and the steps and the to-dos and get them slotted into the right base path, and then come up with a sort of a marriage between what they do and baseline selling. So once we got them doing the right sales process, we created a staged, visual, criteria-based pipeline. We developed the KPIs to keep the pipeline filled, and we developed their sales leadership team, and then we started training their sales team. So they went from, I think they were flat 4 years in a row at around 24 million. We started working with them in May. We started sales training in October because the first 6 months was systems, processes, and sales leadership. Get them to the point where they could coach to support sales training. Sales training started October, went through May, and in June, I think they were at 60 million, and they got bought.
My goodness.
So that's the way it should be.
That had
But
to feel good.
it felt good to them. They got bought for a nice amount of money, and after flat for 4 years and then almost tripling, that's pretty awesome. But what that shows is how much business is being left on the table, how many opportunities are slipping through the fingers of their sales force just because they aren't following a process and they're not paying attention to the details and they aren't trained to sell consultatively, and they're out there just winging it, selling by the seat of their pants without a lot of direction, without a lot of coaching, without a lot of accountability. So we can point to pipeline, we can point to process, we can point to skills and competencies and best practices, but in most companies, it's all of those things aren't the way we need them to be.
What a great example. So Dave, as you work with so many companies, where do they get stuck as they start implementing this process?
Without question, the hardest part to implement is learning to sell consultatively, because that's all about listening and asking questions. And most salespeople don't do that very well.
Okay.
So they're comfortable presenting and telling. So that
How do you
takes
help them
the
over that?
I'm sorry?
How do you help them over that?
Repetition, a lot of role playing,
Okay.
teaching their sales managers how to coach them better in that area. It takes months to make the transition from selling transactionally to being effective selling consultatively. And we have to overcome that need for approval along the way, because that prevents them from asking questions. So even though we've taught them what it looks like and sounds like, we've taught them what the dialogue can accomplish the first week, and we've reinforced that every other week for months. It takes months before all of them can do it. Some of them will do it right away, but it takes months before they can all do that effectively. And there's no shortcut. It's not natural. It's not what they've been doing all of their life. It's not what they do in their relationships. It's not what they've ever done when they've sold. And they can see why it's important, but it doesn't make it any easier for them to do it.
Exactly. Well, and most companies are reinforcing the transactional by giving you a lot of product training and not a lot of other skills training. So,
And in those same companies, in addition to the training, they're establishing as one of their KPIs the demo. That's a milestone in the process. So how many demos today? I mean, we were doing that in 1973. How many sales calls, how many demos, how many closes? And it isn't about demos. And the close is just the end result of having thoroughly gone through a process that's been customized and optimized to work in a particular business or industry, calling on a particular decision maker in another vertical. So everything, it's an integrated approach to making everything work. And a lot of companies will pick one thing, like the phone will ring. We need somebody to come in and train our salespeople on how to be better at closing. It's never about closing. It's about all the things that got screwed up and missed before closing. So in most companies, they don't even know what they need to work on, and they don't know why they're getting the results they get. So it's usually 10 or 12 things that are wrong, not one or two.
Mm-hmm. Very smart advice. Well, Dave, with that, I'm going to ask you, what is the one thing that you recommend our sales reps and our viewers could do today to help themselves be more successful?
That's a great question. Just one thing. One thing. Do the thing that they're afraid to do. Ask the question they're afraid to ask. Make the statement they're afraid to say. Behave in the way they're afraid to behave. Take the one thing that they're comfortable doing and don't do that, and pick something difficult instead. I mean, the question's in their head. They're just choosing not to ask it. And we could go back to the 1950s. I forget the guy's name. He was from the insurance industry. I think his last name might have been Gray. But he had a quote that was perfect, that's still applicable today in 2012. And it was, the only difference between the sales superstars and everybody else is that the sales superstars choose to do what's difficult. And that still sums it up.
That's a perfect way to sum up our interview.
You could also say they choose to do what they don't really want to do. And everybody else just does what they're comfortable doing.
Yep, exactly. Well, thank you so much, Dave, for helping us in so many areas throughout our sales process as well as our sales pipeline so that we really can get a better return for our effort. Appreciate it.
You're welcome, Mira. It's my pleasure to join you.
And thank you to our viewers for tuning in and investing in your own success. The Sales Mastery Summit is here to help you never stop learning from the best. Take care.